Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Stevens, and I'm a resident scholar here at AEI. I'm delighted to welcome you all here and our online audience to our event today. Today's event is called Going Upstream, Closing the Achievement Gap Before It Starts. And it brings four wonderful people to AEI. We're first going to hear a presentation from Ian Rowe and Sarah Waltzer, who are working together on a very exciting new project in New York City that's aiming to go upstream in the education process by strengthening the early skills of future students rather than waiting to remediate once children have already entered school. Ian Rowe is the CEO of Public Prep, which is a highly successful network of single-sex elementary and charter schools in the Bronx and Manhattan. He previously worked for Teach for America, the White House, MTV Social Impact, and the Gates Foundation. Sarah Waltzer is the CEO of the Parent-Child Home Program, which is an international network of program sites that provide low-income families with the skills and tools they need to ensure that their children reach their greatest potential in school and in life. Previously, Sarah was counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Legislation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, working on early childhood and family support issues. Before that, she was legislative assistant and counsel to Senator Joseph Lieberman from Connecticut, working on early childhood education, housing, and anti-poverty initiatives. And she also oversaw children and family issues for the Clinton-Gore Domestic Policy Transition Team. After Ian and Sarah's presentation, we are very lucky to have Checker, Finn, and Ralph Smith, two of the best minds in education, here with us today for a panel discussion on both the promise and the challenge of K-12 collaboration with early childhood as a school improvement strategy. Checker Finn is a distinguished senior fellow and president emeritus at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. And as many of you know, he's been on the forefront of national debate about school reform for over 4 decades. He's an elegant and prolific writer and has done so many things in so many different capacities that it would take a very long time to describe them. There's an informative Wikipedia entry if anyone is interested in more details. Among the many boards Checker served on, he's currently on the National Council on Teacher Quality, Core Knowledge Foundation, and the Maryland State Board of Education. Ralph Smith is the managing director of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which is a highly successful nationwide initiative to disrupt intergenerational poverty by mobilizing communities to build and own solutions to a major obstacle on the pathway out of poverty, which is the failure to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. The Campaign for Grade Level Reading was initiated in 2010, and under Ralph's extraordinary leadership has grown to more than 300 communities in over 44 states. Prior to his work with the campaign, Ralph spent 2 decades working with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and prior to that, 2 decades on the law faculty at University of Pennsylvania, where he taught in a not related field of corporations and security regulations. Before I turn the podium over to Ian and Sarah, I want to take a couple of minutes to share my thoughts on why the topic of this event is so important. For much of the past century, we've relied heavily on the public schools to level the playing field and ensure that all children have an equal opportunity at the starting gate. But over the last few decades, we've been grappling with a large and persistent gap in achievement between advantaged and disadvantaged children, and essentially flat performance on the National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP. Graduation rates are up since the early 70s when NAEP was first administered. So the scores in mathematics and reading for 12th graders that you see on the screen reflect a larger, more diverse group of 12th graders. But 4th and 8th grade NAEP scores are also close to flat, and none of these scores are anywhere near what we've been aiming for, as we've more than doubled school spending over the last several decades. These outcomes are not for lack of trying either. Over the past decades, we've seen an accelerating parade of efforts to improve schools, all failing to do much to move the needle for children's overall performance. My own background is in K-12. I started in the mid-90s and ran a program also in New York City to recruit and prepare teachers for low-performing schools. I was on sort of the early end of school reform and was part of a really important effort to make schools work for all children. We know that good schools are crucial to children's success. But we also know that education really means human development, not schooling. And a substantial body of science now strongly suggests that the essential foundation for educational opportunity is laid not at age 5 or 4 or even 3, but beginning at birth. That's why I was so excited to hear about Ian and Sarah's new groundbreaking project, and why I'm so delighted that they're here today to tell us about how they are going upstream to ensure success, this long-term success of all children. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Catherine. As Catherine said, I am the CEO of Public Prep. I'm Ian Rowe. Public Prep is the nation's oldest nonprofit network exclusively focused on single-sex elementary and middle public charter schools. We have all girls and all boys schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I'm going to get the clicker. There you go. Girls Prep was our first school. It was founded in 2005 as the first all-girls public charter school in New York City. Those are a couple of our graduates there. Since 2005, Girls Prep has now grown into Public Prep, a much larger network. We now have nearly 2,000 students across 5 campuses. We have about 500 alumni. And so we're very excited to have supported those girls, and soon we'll have our boys graduating from 8th grade as well. And so with our success back in 2015, this is just some of the colleges that our students who started with us back in 2005, these are some of the colleges and universities that our girls now as freshmen and sophomores are attending. So we're very excited about that pipeline. But we knew that we could serve more students, and we really wanted to go to those locations in New York that had the greatest need. So back in 2015, there's a great organization in New York called the Citizens Committee for Children, and each year they rank New York City's 59 community districts based on 18 different measures of child well-being. And three of those measures in education are what percent of 3 and 4-year-olds are enrolled in early education programs, what are the reading and math levels on the annual state tests, and what are the high school graduation rates. Of the 59 districts in New York City, the top 5 with the highest overall risk to child well-being were all located in the South Bronx. The Hunts Point area, the South Bronx, which was the lowest, the highest risk district to children, had dismally low percentages of 3 and 4-year-olds enrolled in an early education program. Not surprisingly, only 10% of all children in all of Hunts Point were reading at grade level. Math was not much better, 12.1%. High school graduation rates, 37%. So this clearly seemed like an area that could benefit from having better schools. So we made a decision to focus all of our growth, all of our new schools, to open in the South Bronx. And so we decided to move our headquarters from hip Tony Tribeca in Manhattan to 148th Street in the South Bronx. And we decided to go on a walking tour with my team just to get to know the neighborhood. Where's the local bodega? Where do you get the best chili relleno? And so just to get to know the neighborhood. And on that walking tour, we encountered a 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck that, by the cheery reaction of the people that were standing by the truck, seemed to be a fixture in the neighborhood. And as you can see from the picture, it had on the side of the bus, "Who's your daddy?" And it turned out that Who's Your Daddy is actually a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks are paying somewhere between $350 to $500 to answer questions such as, "Is she my sister? Are you my father?" And it turned out that this was sort of an outgrowth of the fact that this was a community in which it had an extremely high non-marital birth rate. And in fact, in this area of the Bronx, the non-marital birth rate was nearly 80% for young women aged 24 and under who gave birth. And so these numbers were staggering, but as I did more research, I discovered that what was happening in the Bronx was a microcosm of what was happening across the United States in rural and urban America. So this table is just a snapshot of the data we looked at back then. These are births just in 2015 to women 24 and under. As you can see, it's what I call an equal opportunity tsunami, in that the largest number of young women having non-marital births, 24 and under, are white. The percentages, nearly 62% of white births were non-marital in the Black community, and 90%. Overall, 71%. These are staggering numbers, but in particular, of the young women 24 and under who were having births in 2015, 41% were having their second through their 8th child. So like in the Bronx, nationwide, across race, there are large numbers of very young single mothers raising very young children, and in many cases, multiple children under the ages of 5. Now, of course, it must be said that being a child of a single parent is no guarantee of failure. Simultaneously, because we have many, many strong single moms and single parents in our schools, nor does being the child of a married, 2-parent household guarantee success. But the odds are overwhelming that children being raised in environments like we were seeing in Hunts Point are at great risk of having multiple adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Many of you may know ACEs are traumatic events that can have negative, lasting effects on a child's health and well-being. So these things include neglect, physical abuse, mental abuse, parent incarceration, maternal depression, domestic violence, all things that we know intuitively are not good for kids. But as Sarah and will show, and Catherine mentioned, emerging neuroscience is showing that the association of developmental delay that's associated with children who have multiple risk factors, these are just environmental factors that impact the development capacities of young children. And so here you see an example: as the number of risk factors increases, the higher the percent of developmental delay probability within children. And then, as many folks have seen within the education arena, the Hart-Risley study, you can see that these gaps that exist in vocabulary, social emotional development, start very early. And so the question that I have pondered as the leader of a charter network that right now we're chartered kindergarten through 8th grade, by the time a child reaches 5 years old and comes into our school, a lot has already happened. And so the key question: what can a K-12 school actually do? Do we just have to be passive recipients of children who are experiencing these adverse childhood experiences and experiencing these difficulties? Or is there a way to not have to focus on remediation and instead focus on prevention and actual growth? So at Public Prep, we have taken what I call our 18 to 18 approach. Because this firewall that has existed between K-12 and early childhood education, we need to break that firewall. We don't have to be passive recipients of children that already have deficits on vocabulary or social emotional development. So for us, 18 to 18 means supporting our scholars starting as young as 18 months old, all the way through 18 years old. So our alumni, who are typically in their first year of college, to ensure they focus on achieving 30 college credits, which is a great indicator of on-time college completion. So just to give you an example, this won't be the thrust of this presentation, but for our graduating 8th graders, we have a class called Pathways to Power, which highlights the different series of decisions most correlated to life success. So for example, there is data associated with something called the success sequence that shows that if young adults who grew up in a low-income family completes their education, secures full-time work, marriage, then children, in that order, only 6% land in poverty. This is data that's crucial for young people to hear, especially if they live in communities in which they're not personally witnessing these types of behaviors. So that focus of Public Prep's work is about changing the attitudes and behaviors of graduating 8th graders, entering the next 12 years of their lives in high school, college, and the first 4 years of young adulthood, to hopefully help them make better decisions so that we see less numbers of kids in these situations in which kids are being raised with adverse childhood experiences. But while we're thinking about the next generation, we also have the urgency of now. There are kids today who are not yet in formal schooling who are in these situations, and what can be done? So again, at Public Prep in 2014, we actually became one of the first charter networks to actually launch a pre-K program in New York City. We partnered up with Sesame Workshop, and so we now run pre-prep, the Joan Gantz Cooney Early Learning Program. In partnership with Sesame Workshop, we have close to 100 students in our pre-prep program in the Bronx. We'll be opening up in the Lower East Side this fall. We'll certainly be one of the largest providers of pre-K in the city, and it's crucial that we get our 4-year-olds. So even though we are chartered kindergarten through 8th grade, we recognize that what we do before and after formal schooling is crucial to the long-term success of our kids. But even with the earlier start at 4 years old, we still saw children who had suffered from lack of access to high-quality learning experiences. And then interestingly, at drop-off and arrival, we might see a mom bringing her first grader to school and yet have a very young one in a baby carriage. And so I was constantly thinking, how could we reach that toddler who is still 3 years away from our girls' prep or boys' prep school, but very high likelihood that they will be entering school a few years from now? What could we actually do? It was then that I discovered Sarah Waltzer and the Parent-Child Home Program. They were a great board member, Marjorie Mayer, who connected us. And Parent-Child Home Program engages children as young as 18 months old. And because of the charter law, I know that we can offer guaranteed entry to our schools through sibling preference in our lottery. So that mom of a first grader, I can now say to her that your younger child, when your younger child hits 18 months, you can have 2 years of home visits from an early learning specialist that not only helps your child build their vocabulary and school readiness, it will also help increase your capacity as a parent to help in your child's learning. And so then the partnership was born. And we've had incredibly strong interest from our families. One of the things that's so important is that we already have a trusting relationship with our families because they have a child in our school, and now we're offering an additional support for their younger siblings. So we started a pilot about a year ago, January. Nearly 30 families are now participating in the home visits, and we definitely want to accelerate the growth and participation and optimally build a longitudinal research study that shows the differential outcomes over time. We do think this relationship is a game changer. And while we obviously don't yet have longitudinal results for this study, Sarah will talk about the 50-year history of Parent-Child Home Program in other settings, I thought it'd be helpful to read one parent's reflections on how her son has performed as a result of being in the Parent-Child Home Program. And so in response to a question, this parent says, how would you describe your experience with PCHP? And she says, it was amazing, something really different. I have 5 kids, they went to daycare, but it was different from with Jeffrey. Jeffrey has learned and understand to sit and read with me. Mommy, read these books with me. My other kids were not like this. He loves books and we sit to read together most of the time. I plan my time to sit with Jeffrey. We all have together time to read and talk about our day or just play with toys, play games, 45 minutes to 1 hour daily. What did you like most about the program? 30 minutes is short, but it makes a difference because 2 times per week, 30 minutes per visit is the length of the visit. Jeffrey is now in pre-K because he's now graduated, but can be in kindergarten. He sits and pays attention with no problem. Through the program, Jeffrey has developed skills to go to school, skills like knowing the colors, the alphabet, writing his name. Also, he has favorite books. Napping House is in his book bag every day. Every time he wants to read, he brings out the Napping House. And finally, how has the program helped you and your child? It brought us together at a different level. I ask him questions about school, and he asks me about my work. He communicates with siblings about their day. I wish I knew about this earlier. We spend more time together. We spend quality time. It was worth it. We think that's a great anecdotal example of what we hope to see over and over and over again with parents who are facing the challenge of having young children and then even younger siblings and what we can do to have their children have a better start. So with that, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Walzer. I'm the CEO of the Parent-Child Home Program. And Ian just set me up perfectly because those reflections from that parent are what we want every parent doing with their child before their child sets foot in a classroom. And we want every parent feeling as their child embarks on that pathway to power. In order for children to get on the pathway to power that Ian described, they have to be ready. They have to be ready to set foot on that pathway as they enter a classroom. And that's what Parent-Child Home Program is set up to do. There is a transformative power in reaching families before their children enter a classroom, building that secure attachment, that the communication and the social emotional skills that children need to navigate classrooms and to navigate life. And there's a transformative power for parents. For many of the parents we work with, as you can see from some of what Ian talked about and you'll see from some of our data, many of those parents had pretty negative experiences with school themselves. Walking into a school to help their child navigate the academic world is not something they're comfortable with. It's often something they back away from. Part of what happens with parent-child home program parents is that they are confident that they know their child, they know how their child learns, they know what their child knows, and they're comfortable going to that parent-teacher conference, going in and telling the school what their child needs. That's the transformative power of working with parents before their children enter school. So what do we actually do that yields all these wonderful results that that Ian has talked about and that we're going to talk about? 92 home visits, twice a week for 2 23-week cycles. The visits are, as Ian noted, a half hour. And that half hour, there's magic in that, right? It's the time, well, for those of you who have experienced 2 and 3-year-olds, it's the attention span of a 2 or 3-year-old. But the goal is that we're not putting extra pressure on families or on children to sit still, to take too much time out of days that have a lot of demands in them. And we're modeling for parents what this mother said, that it took only a half hour to figure out that reading, talking, playing was so powerful and magical that she now does it with all of her children for more time. The other key aspects of the program, it's neighborhood-based. Ian talked about the trust relationship between public prep families who have been recruited to the program and public prep. Well, we build that trust relationship with our families in every community where we work, because the person knocking on their door and asking them to participate in the program shares a cultural background, lives in their neighborhood, speaks their language, all of the things that make folks be willing to open the door and let that person into their home. Because that's a big thing we're asking of folks, to let this stranger into your home to sit with you twice a week, 92 times. We bring a gift of a book or an educational toy each week. Most of the homes that we're visiting do not have books. The books that we bring in are reading materials not just for that 2 and 3-year-old, but for other siblings, for the parents. We see, and you'll see in our data, 15% of our parents do not have literacy skills when they start in the program. Many of them gain literacy skills just by reading the children's books with their kids. The power of having those books and educational toys in the home, I think, even without everything else, really cannot be diminished. We also provide significant connections to other services in the community. So we are able to, if that home visitor goes in and the family's just gotten an eviction notice, or their heat's been turned off, or they don't have enough food stamps to get through the month, they're going to be able to connect them to other resources in the community that will help ensure that that child is not experiencing the ACEs that come from being hungry, being homeless, not having the right clothing for the weather, all of the things that may happen in low-income homes. Oh, so now you're going to see
when he go to school, he's going to have confidence.
High five. Good job. Smart.
It's beautiful for him. I love it.
Anisha's amazing. Thank you. She's amazing. To see her now know that this isn't it. I want more for them, and I want more for me, and go for that.
This program made me and my family so happy and so excited. I feel like I want to help another family walk in the same footsteps me and Amari did.
She's going to be a home visitor for the program. She's going to be an awesome asset to someone else's life.
I'm so excited.
And so I'm going to help them.
Thank you. I get to work and do something that really means something to me.
The other powerful thing about the Parent-Child Home Program, 25% of our staff are parents who went through the program as parents. We are building our own workforce in the communities where we work, and we are providing employment for parents who may not have had that ladder to the workforce before they participated in the program. We lose those folks when we've provided them with such good training that school districts hire them away to be classroom aides, and that's okay. We'll take it if that's where they're going. But that is a powerful message to the other parents who we work with in a community. When the person who's visiting them, who is being paid to do this work in their community, is someone who went through the program before then, whose children are now navigating school successfully. So a little bit about Parent-Child Home Program participants. This gives you, this is not just the public prep families, it's a snapshot of the work that we're doing across New York City, but it gives you a really good sense of the whole variety of barriers that the families who participate in the program are facing. I think a couple of key things that you're not seeing on here that I want to layer on top of them. This is sort of a general snapshot of the families. When we're then deciding in any of the communities where we work who gets priority for the program, we have a needs index, and that needs index looks at things like a parent who has multiple children under the age of 5, because we know that that's a risk factor for not entering school ready, but also for increased stress, maternal depression, other challenges that are going to make that parent-child bond and that academic readiness challenging. We prioritize single parents, as Ian referenced. We prioritize grandparents raising grandchildren. Another thing that we see increasingly across the country, particularly as a result of the opioid crisis, and we know that those grandparents need support. Many of them are doing this at quite an elderly age and often with multiple grandchildren. Again, a stressor at home that means those children are less likely to enter school ready to learn. So think about this snapshot of who these children are, and then let's look at what happens when they participate in the program. This is, again, a snapshot from the New York City data of the short-term outcomes of the program. This is what we see for families over the 2 cycles of home visits in the program. CBT is the child behavior traits measure that we use. It's a school readiness measure for children that looks particularly at their social emotional development, also at some language and literacy pieces. And the PACT is a parent-child interaction measure that looks at the quality and quantity of that parent-child interaction. A couple of key things. It's a 4-point scale. It's a 5-point scale, but 4 is the highest. It's 0 to 4. So if you look at the trajectory for these families, they are getting to where we want them to be. Between a 3 and a 4 means that child is ready for school, and those parents are ready to support that child in school. Another little thing I want to note, because maybe a thing that Ralph brings up, is you see that there's a little bit of a summer slide. Many of our sites take a break in the summer between the 2 cycles of the program. They operate on school year calendars. And you see with the parent-child interaction measure, when we go back in the fall, there's been a little dip. We are actually now working with most of our sites to do year-round implementation of the program to prevent that summer slide from happening. But what does this all lead to? This is just telling you that when they finish US, the children are ready for school, and that parent-child interaction has become much more robust, both in the way it's happening and in the amount of it that's happening. And again, those are things you can tell from the anecdotal example that Ian read, and from the wonderful smiling mother in our video who is now going on to be a visitor. And I will tell you, her son is now in school, and the teachers are raving about him. So the anecdotal continues, but I know what you all really want to know is what happens long term. So this is what happens long term, and one of the wonderful things about having been a model that's been around for 50 years, research in a lot of different settings, is we have a lot of data like this. We know that kids who have this program are 50% more likely to be ready for kindergarten than their socioeconomic peers who have not had access to this program. We know that they outperform the state average in math on 3rd grade achievement tests. And we highlight the math here because they also do in reading. But people don't expect a program that has its origins in early literacy and getting parents to read, talk, and play with their children to have math outcomes as well. And this, I think, triggers off of the other things we're going to talk about, which is these kids are socially and emotionally ready to be in a classroom. And if you talk to kindergarten teachers, what they need is children who have the skills to be in a classroom and learn. And they will tell you over and over again, I don't need that child to be already reading. I need them to be able to listen, to communicate with their classmates, to sit in a circle for story time, to raise their hands, to have executive function and self-regulation skills. That's what teachers need. And that's what means that you're performing on grade level in both reading and math when you get to 3rd grade, because you walked into that classroom ready to be a good student. So program graduates score 2.5 times higher on social emotional skill assessments than a control group. This is from a recent study conducted in New York City with a diverse array of low-income children, the vast majority of whom live in homes with incomes under $10,000 a year. A new statistic that's not up there, but builds on the special ed data out of third grade that you see up there, is that are the kids in the New York City randomized control trial are 4 times less likely to be recommended for an IEP in kindergarten. This is an enormous cost savings for school districts. If children don't need special ed services, you are going to save, well, you're going to see it on the next slide, at least $210,000 for that child over the course of their time in school. That money could all be redirected to doing these early childhood activities with children across the country. We also know from a study that was done in Massachusetts in the 90s that our kids are 30% more likely to graduate from high school than their socioeconomic peers. They're graduating at the rates of middle-class kids nationally. And again, that's not because the home visitor read to them when they were 2 and 3. It's because the home visitor helped the parent build those school readiness skills and gave the parent also the skills to help their child navigate the educational world. So lastly, a little bit about the economic benefits of the program. I touched on the significant cost savings that you get from lowering the need for special education services. And that harkens back to what Ian highlighted about the developmental delays that we see in children who have all these negative experiences before they get to a classroom. The fact of the matter is, if we can negate those negative experiences by providing these positive experiences for the child and the parent before they start school, we are going to significantly reduce the number of children who are referred to special ed services, a huge cost savings for school districts and for society. And I will add into that the other piece I've been told to make sure I tell you, which is how much the program costs. Depending on where you are in the country, between $5,000 and $10,000 to provide the full program to the children. If you look at the cost savings that you get from providing these services to families before their children enter school, I think you get a good sense of why it's a valuable investment. And that doesn't even take into account things like hiring parents to work in the program as it grows in a community, which is a whole separate set of economic infusion into that particular community, as well as into the life of that family. And there you have it.
Let's up here to discuss. So I want to begin by saying thank you guys very much. That was an amazing presentation. So exciting. So glad you guys are doing this.
Yes.
Yeah. Checker and Ralph, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this project and implications. I think I'd like to start, Ralph, by asking you, from the point of view of kind of a mega practitioner working all over the country with communities on getting kids to grade level reading, what are your thoughts on this program and this approach and the issue in general of the going upstream idea?
Well, except for the fact that you say I'm a mega practitioner. There's something awfully scary about that. It's going to take me a while to unpack that. This is a wonderful idea that's well executed. And I say that from some experience. When we started the campaign, we spoke with a number of educators at an event that was called the Celebration for Teaching and Learning. Some people in this room may recall the late Ron Thorne, who had that as a major event. And it attracted educators from around the country. And we had focus groups, and we put to them this question. And the question was, assume your school district had all of its elementary schools with a culture that promoted teaching and learning, with strong school leadership, with well-trained classroom teachers able to deliver a rigorous curriculum through exciting pedagogy, and that curriculum was aligned to rigorous standards. And you get the fact that in that question was the whole package of education reforms that so many of us were spending our time on. Say, would that close the achievement gap? And almost to a person in each focus group, they said no. We repeated that again at NBC's Education Nation. Some of you may remember that. The same question to a select group of exemplary educators who were invited to that event. And they gave us the same answer, uniformly no. And the conversation that ensued wasn't always politically correct. It wasn't always what we might want, but those educators understood that what happened in the school and the classroom was only part of the story. And despite the blaming of parents and communities and everything else, they were clear that if those things weren't dealt with, they weren't going to succeed, which was a kind of a wake-up call to the folks who had put a whole lot of time and thought into arguing about issues of governance. And Shekhar knows that's an acknowledgement of the debate about governance and the issue of culture and content within the school classroom. Flash forward 8 years. We have 300 plus communities in the campaign for grade level reading. And what we find, I want to call it an inconvenient truth. And the inconvenient truth is this, that a large and growing number of young children are falling beyond the reach of schools. I want you to just think for a moment about the implications of this notion that kids are falling beyond the reach of schools. And we know who those children are, and we know where they live. And those are the kids who come to school already so far behind that the way we resource schools and structure teaching and learning, those kids are not going to catch up. And it's really uncomfortable for us ever to say that a kid won't catch up. But the fact of the matter is, most of those kids won't ever catch up. Moreover, those kids who perhaps need the most schooling get the least because they're absent from school more often than all the other kids. That's where, in many respects, there's a chronic absence challenge. And those are the same kids who are in such risky situations that they lose ground over the summer and come back to school in September, farther behind than when they left in June. So the experience of the campaign for grade level reading essentially squares up right with the opening presentation here, that unless we do something and things in a fairly dramatically different way, we're not going to improve educational outcomes for a large number of kids. We're not going to close the achievement gap, but more scarily, we're going to lose a growing part of the next generation of young people. So, I wanted to stand up in the back and applaud, because I think what you're essentially forging is a proof point for some of what could and should be done if we're going to take seriously the promise of education, to level the playing field, and to give our kids a chance.
So one of the things that's interesting in this moment in people's thinking about K-12 is I think there is this growing understanding that Ralph, really just what you've just said, and that's kind of strikingly reflected in our new federal education law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. All of the early learning provisions from that are in the handout on people's chairs, and I've been going through those, and it's striking how often the word birth appears in ESSA. I went back and looked at No Child Left Behind, and the word birth doesn't really appear in No Child Left Behind. So in ESSA, there is, just in the narrative, there's a clear acknowledgement that federal education funding it needs to be, number one, when we're thinking about this, we have to be thinking about the earlier years, and there are now expanded provisions that are enabling and encouraging state and school education agencies to spend money on early childhood, which is repeatedly described in ESSA as birth to kindergarten entry. So Checker, we're now right in your area of expertise, which is thinking about these big picture policy questions. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, both on what kind of the value of this approach, and how we can get at it, how we can advocate it, promote it, advance it on a more systemic level, and whether having it in ESSA is making sense.
All that.
All that, yeah.
I'll get to that in a second. First, I had one burning question for Sarah. You talked about how much it costs, but you didn't say anything about where the funding comes from.
You've got to my answer to the next question Catherine's going to ask me, which is how do we make this happen? Right now, it comes from everywhere that we can possibly find it. So it comes from some home visiting dollars, although home visiting dollars are very much focused on health and abuse and neglect home visiting, and haven't had that school readiness and the 2 to 4 year old focus. It comes a little bit from Title I. In school districts with very forward-thinking district leadership, and that's not always the case. They don't all see the world like Ian does. It comes from private philanthropy, a lot of private philanthropy around the country, a lot of United Ways, and some corporate funders in cities who have looked around and said, our workforce 20 years from now is not where we need it to be, because the folks that we need to work in our companies are not graduating from high school, and we need to change this by starting to work at the other end of the pipeline.
It sounds like you might have just said scrounging.
Yeah.
Because I'm hearing a CEO does a lot of fundraising.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. You know, arguably, the only original research I've ever done in my life took about 5 minutes with the help of a hand calculator, which is I once set out to figure out how much of a child's life do they spend in school. And it was a pretty simple calculation. I assumed full attendance from full day, kindergarten through 12th grade. So I took the 13 years of school times 180 days times 6 hours a day. That was the numerator. The denominator was how many hours has an 18-year-old been on Earth. And you do the long division. This really doesn't take very long, especially with a hand calculator. The answer is 9%. 0.09 is the percentage of a child's life that they spend in school if they have perfect attendance between kindergarten and 12th grade.
Between zero, oh.
No, the child's life is 0 to 18. The school experience is kindergarten through 12th grade, and it's 0.09. Now, obviously, some of the other 91% is spent sleeping, but you still have to consider what is the leverage of the school in the K-12 experience if they only have 9% of the child's life, which speaks exactly to what you all are talking about. And yes, you can add to schooling. You can have longer days and years, which I think, especially for disadvantaged kids, is a very good idea. You can start younger. You can, if you do it well, you'll benefit. But most people, when they think about starting younger, are thinking 4-year-olds, and it's good to start with 4-year-olds. Okay, but the problem with the direction that so much of early learning in this country is going, and it's not a problem in ESSA, it's a problem in what states are doing with ESSA, is that they're turning it into a universal pre-K program. The right to use Title I dollars and other federal title dollars is being sort of, in the states that are thinking at all about early learning, which I believe, according to one of your calculations, Catherine, is something like 15 states have actually embarked on something in this realm. Mostly, it's adding to the push for universal 4-year-old pre-K. This is a big mistake. This is a big mistake for 2 reasons. And they're pretty obvious. One, it doesn't start nearly young enough for the kids that need it badly. And the other is that it's a needless windfall for a bunch of families that are doing okay without the subsidy. In Maryland, on the last kindergarten readiness assessment, which is statewide, given basically either to all or a good sampling of entering kindergartners, almost half the kids were deemed kindergarten ready. Some of them are being publicly subsidized in one program or another, but many of them aren't. They're just being kindergarten ready because of the arrangements their families are making for them. And then there were 18% of kids who weren't anywhere near ready. And then there were kids in between. Sort of, I forget what the state's euphemism is, but it's sort of getting ready is what that boils down to. 18% of the kids, though, in Maryland are far, far, far from kindergarten ready. It's a bigger number in the South Bronx. Those are the kids for whom these programs and resources need to be directed, concentrated, focused, and starting very young, starting as close to the cradle as you can get there. Toddlers, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. And but the push for universal preschool is at war with the greatest need that we've been talking about up here, which is the need for a relatively small fraction, let's say 18% statewide, of severely disadvantaged kids to have a very intensive intervention program. And since you don't do it in an institutional setting with toddlers, like add to school, you do it at home, or you do it in some other place where you find toddlers. It might be daycare, it might be a competent Head Start program. We could go on to a long time about Head Start. But it's not by adding to the school experience. Adding to the school experience has lots of political oomph behind it. Teachers' unions above all. They're also mindful that the high school kid population is diminishing. And the colleges are poaching on it with dual credit, and so the K-12 enrollment's going to go down. We better add somebody. Well, let's add 4-year-olds. And let's keep up the numbers and keep up the funds that come with them. This is not the way to think about the problem that we're talking about today, which is closing the learning gap preemptively, because adding 4-year-olds isn't going to do very much of that. It'll do a little of that, of course. Moreover, what we're adding 4-year-olds to in the typical school, I believe Ian's schools are welcome, healthy, happy, terrific exceptions to this, but in the typical school, we're adding pre-K to a program that isn't any good already. For starting in K. Bill Bennett, when he was Secretary of Education, used to have a sort of joke line about what he called the myth of the 14-egg omelet. He said, if you are a very bad chef and you cannot make an edible omelet with 12 eggs in it, what makes you think that adding 2 more eggs is going to produce a better result? You're a bad chef. It's not that you don't have enough eggs. So I don't want us to think that adding eggs to the bowl is going to produce a better omelet if the chef is no good. And too many schools, especially schools attended by disadvantaged kids, that is the case today. So we've got an opportunity under ESSA to do it right, but it's sounding like the forces that are pushing for a universal 4-year-old pre-K are going to likely keep us from doing it right. So there.
Let me just, I'm going to resist, and there are people in the audience who know that it takes a lot of discipline on my part. I'm going to resist the implication of a head start. I'm going to resist. I'm going to resist the invitation to talk about unions. Check it, I have done this often.
For a long time.
For a long time. So we're going to resist all that. What I am going to do is, because there is a real kernel here that's important and even accurate, and that is that we are avoiding a lot by focusing solely or primarily on pre-K. And there was this one line, Sarah, in your slide when you talked about the partnerships. We go to the 4 and 5-year-olds because we're under the impression that we can avoid dealing with parents. That even though we love these cute and cuddly kids, we're deeply ambivalent about their parents. And if we focus on 0 to 3-year-olds, we've got no way around the parents, because those kids are not going to walk themselves to the program. And this ambivalence about parents, the judging and the blaming and the horrible narrative, operates as a significant constraint on success. So we tend to say, how little can we interact with parents? And we move toward older kids. And Ian and Sarah, what I think is important here is the home visiting piece. There's not a moving or running away from parents. There's a running toward parents. There's an embrace, and there's a deep understanding that we're not going to change the calculus if we don't change what happens in the very earliest years of that child's life. And the only way we're going to change that meaningfully is to engage parents, to acknowledge them as co-producers of good outcomes for their kids, as essential partners in this enterprise, and to help to provide them with the skills and the opportunity and the experiences that they need to fulfill their role as brain builders, coach, and whatnot. And I don't think it's about so much about all of the things that Cheka says, as much as our general tendency to think that low-income parents, and low-income parents of color especially, are simply not good enough for their kids. And we have a better idea. And that better idea has to start when we think we can move them away from their parents. And if we can get over that, and if we could acknowledge that and put that on the table, I think we can make progress, Catherine, because I do believe that you're right, that kindergarten is too late, that we've got to start much earlier. I agree with Arnie Duncan, we've got to stop playing catch-up, but none of those things will happen if we don't deal with parents.
Yep.
And the way this intersects with what I said is that we're dealing with the 91% that kids aren't in school. We are tackling a portion of the 91% by tackling the home and working with the parents, instead of just expanding the 9% to 12% or something by going to 4-year-old schooling. We're actually going to the non-school part of the kid's life, which I think is a crucial point.
Ian, the question I wanted to ask you is, you are a K-12 person. You are coming at this from the point of view of running schools. And I'm wondering what your reflections are on these points, on what Ralph was just saying, in terms of blocks.
Sure. Well, when I became CEO of Public Prep in 2010, at that time our network was kindergarten through 6th grade. And I, like many other educators, thought, that's fine. We, regardless of what has happened before, these 5-year-olds show up,
We got them from the beginning.
We've got this. We
Right,
can do
right,
amazing
right.
things, and especially when you compare yourself to the outcomes of the district that you're in, which aren't so great, even marginally improved performance, you pat yourself on your back and you say, we're doing great things. But if you're really honest about the ultimate outcomes of our kids, whether you look at high school graduation rates, college completion rates, NAEP, you just cannot ignore that what is happening in the first few years of life does have lasting impact despite all of our great efforts. Necessary, K-12, but not sufficient. And so what we've discovered is that our parents, especially in the earliest years, that's the point at which they're the most highly motivated when they have very young children, because there's a sense of, regardless of their situation, they want to create the best environment for their kids right now, right? Life hasn't yet happened that has created all the negative outcomes. And so my child is 12 months old, 18 months old. If I can do something, if I can have a partner, which is the school, but importantly, our network is not running the parent-child home program. So this is not an effort for school to suddenly now take on additional responsibilities. The idea is, how do we find a best-in-class partner that we can channel our kids, because we already have a special relationship with our families, into a partner program that can really cultivate not only the child's vocabulary and school readiness, but the parent's capacity to be an effective teacher at home. That's the kind of partnership that I think makes sense and distributes responsibilities appropriately.
So this is something that you probably wouldn't know yet, but Sarah, it strikes me that, let's say, right now there's a first grader at public prep school. Your program is working with a 2-year-old. There's a decent chance that mother is going to have a baby, another one, right? Has it been the program's experience that I would imagine that the skills that a parent is developing are going to sustain with younger children? Is that something that you guys have looked at?
So we have
specifically?
one small study that has looked at that, and what we saw was that the younger siblings of the children who'd been in the program without getting the program were assessed where the other children were at the end of the program without having had it. So yes, what happens is the parents have those skills now. They understand what they need to be doing at home. They also have all the materials. And I will tell you, we've now been around long enough that those books and toys that we've brought into the home, we have grandparents who are now using them with their grandchildren after having used them with their children and saved them. They become precious learning tools in those homes. And absolutely, they are going to replicate with any additional siblings, and for that matter, with nieces and nephews and cousins and extended family. We see the message of the program permeating in communities. And I want to add something else, because I think it's really important in terms of what folks have been talking about the role of giving parents the tools to be not only that preschool preparer of their children, but part of what we're preparing parents to do and giving them the confidence that they can do is that ongoing academic advocate for their children. And what we hear over and over again, and what we expect to hear from Ian and his principals, is parents who've been to this program, they show up for their parent-teacher conferences because they're comfortable that they know their child and that they can have that conversation with an educator. But not only that, their children aren't absent because they also understand the importance of school and they see the success that their child is having. And the sort of ultimate outcome of that is we, for a long time, had a board member who had been a child in the program. Single parent, immigrant from Colombia, growing up in a housing project in White Plains, New York. When he got to middle school, his mother, who had the parent-child home program with her first child, was calling school about him and his brother to say that the school was not giving them enough homework, that they could do more. She figured out that these immigrant kids were on the wrong track in their middle school. So he's now a lawyer at the corporate headquarters in Tokyo of the company that hired him away from the New York City law firm where he was working. And he still talks about the fact that He hated it when his mother called the middle school and asked that he get more homework. But that's what middle class and upper middle class parents do all the time for their children. They enroll them in enrichment programs. They enroll them in better schools. They shop school districts. His mom was doing that for him because she got the tools, she got the language, she got the power to do that as he moved through school.
So I want to leave us a few minutes for questions. This is very, very frustrating because there are a whole bunch of things that have come up that I think could be another 2 hours of conversation. There's one thing that I wanted to mention that strikes me. There are many, many schools that are not that great, and your schools are amazing.
We try to get better every single day. We never take the title of amazing.
And
We're
there are
trying to be better
there are many home visiting programs that are not great, and yours is amazing. And so you put an amazing school, an amazing home visiting program together, and you're getting these results. And I think just one of the things that I am thinking about is how, which was one of the things we don't have time to talk about, unfortunately, but I hope to continue the conversation with you guys. What can we do to maybe not achieve this level of amazing, but a decent level of amazing with schools and even home visiting programs that are not at you guys are not where you guys are.
Right. Well, I like to describe ourselves. We don't have a track record of success. We have a track record of continuous improvement, and I think it's really important to have that mindset in education because that's what we want for our kids as well. But we should study this. We started this pilot in January. We have nearly 30 families. We definitely want to make a significant increase to that, but we should be able to come back here a year or 2 years from now and show you how are the first graders and second graders who came through the Parent-Child Home Program partnership, how does that differ from kids who may have gone just through our pre-K or who did come in through kindergarten, or we accept transfer students, so who came in at first and second grade, right?
Yes.
So we've got to do that longitudinal study, so it's not just, this should be wonderful, but it's based on the data, we're getting different outcomes.
Yes.
And that's where the philanthropic community, I think, can make a huge difference. I mean, Checker, when you asked where does the money come from, so in New York, this has to come from outside of the K-12 public funding. This has to be a deliberate decision on my part as the CEO to say this is important enough for us to allocate resources. And so hopefully over time, the data that comes for a longitudinal study would start to demonstrate there should be policy that provides a more reliable public funding stream around this kind of initiative.
So we unfortunately only have a few minutes for questions. When someone over here, can you wait for the microphone and say your name and where you're from?
Thanks. Tom Yensel, Executive Director of the National School Boards Association. So as I said, my mother used to say, another country heard from. First of all, thank you. This was very, very interesting. And I don't take exception to what Checker said. I would just maybe put a comma on it because I won't comment on teacher unions. I certainly don't represent them. But I do represent school boards, and I've been around them for 39 years almost. And I think there's been a big transformation about how school leaders look at this issue. And the one point I wanted to put on the table that I think maybe ties all this together is really the brain research that has gotten so much conversation, and certainly within our organization. That, I think, has really helped us to overcome some of the challenges about different funding streams and so on, because clearly early learning, however we defined it, was seen as a separate activity from public education. And so in some cases, you're right, it's 4-year-old programs, but I think we're seeing more and more interest in school districts trying to collaborate with early learning generally. So the question I wanted to ask you is, from your point of view, and hopefully we'll get a chance to chat about this a little more later, but I'd be curious about your take on the barriers that you see from the public education system in terms of how you attach and what we might do together to try to overcome that.
Wonderful question. So as I referenced before, we do have some school districts that have made decisions either to spend some of their Title I money, to spend district dollars on the program. But we also still confront a lot of district leaders who say, my job is K through 12. That's what people are judging me on. And in fact, given the life expectancy of most school superintendents, I'm not even going to be superintendent when that 2-year-old you're working with is in a classroom. I'm not going to see the third grade outcomes that are going to get me the pat on the back. And I think a lot of it is, how do we get folks to think about the fact that we do individual 1-year school district budgets, but we're talking about outcomes that you're going to see the advantages of over the lifetime of that student, and therefore you're making expenditures up front that you're going to recoup, but you're going to recoup over time, not in that year or the next year.
So Sarah, he's the head of the National Association of School Boards. What can be done? Do you have ideas on how to communicate with? That's an important level of the system.
Well, and I think one of them is to really get folks to think about these outcomes and the fact that you need to make those investments first that are then going to get you the payback in the long run. And that some of that is a community decision, some of it is getting some help from private philanthropy to think about, if we really build up our early childhood program while we're still doing the work with those second and third graders who didn't get that, to make sure that they're getting as close to performing on grade level as we can. How do we jumpstart the process, I think, is part of it. Some of it could be additional investments of state and local dollars up front, and some of it could be from private philanthropy.
Decker, you're on a board. What do you think?
Well, first let's at least note that there's a little bit of political skittishness when any governmental agency, which includes a public school district, goes into the home. Like it's almost invasion of privacy kind of thing, or it's none of your business kind of thing. So let's do note that. Let's also note that the staffing of a program like Sarah's is so different from the sort of civil service-y way that government bodies, including school systems, employ people with their certifications and their pay scales and their unions and their all the other paraphernalia that comes with how we structure a government program. I'm a little reluctant almost to see this turn into a government program, though I see the obvious benefit in having a school district want to cooperate with it. I don't think it's the same thing as belonging to the school system, and I don't think it should.
Correct.
No, but it could take the school system's dollars, because
Fair
all
enough.
those Title I dollars can be subcontracted.
Scrounging again.
Yeah, I'm very good at it. You can, but seriously, just like Ian referenced, you can find really high-quality local community-based organizations, many of which are also operating the kinds of after-school programs that the campaign works on. You can find those organizations, and they can be subcontracted with school district dollars, and run it out of that community with the right staffing and the right connection to the families with whom you're working with.
That's right. That's good.
So you guys, it is now 5:15. I am sorry, we only got one question, but it was a very good one. And I think these guys will be around for a few minutes if you want to speak to them individually. Thank you all very much for coming, and please join me in thanking our fabulous panel.
Thank you.